The coffee maker finished its cycle at 6:43. I know the exact time because I've been watching the clock on the microwave the way you do when you can't sleep and you've already given up pretending. My wife was upstairs. That's what I believed. I poured my cup, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the neighbor's sprinklers come on. Automatic, predictable. Every morning at 6:45, same arc, same duration. I'd watched them so many times over the years that I'd stopped seeing them. That morning, I saw them again. I'm not sure why. Her name is Gwendolyn. We met in 1987 at a community college accounting class we were both taking for reasons neither of us remembers clearly anymore. She was wearing a yellow sweater. I remember that. I don't remember much else from that period of my life with any sharpness, but I remember the yellow sweater. We were married 14 months later. That was 36 years ago. I want to be precise about the timeline because I've thought about it so many times since that I need to say it out loud or write it down or whatever this is. 36 years, 2 kids, both grown, both gone in the way that's good. My son Teddy out in Portland with his wife and their little boy. My daughter Rue finishing her PhD up in Ann Arbor. Grandkids, or almost. A house that's too large now. A retirement I'd been looking forward to for a long time and wasn't sure what to do with once it arrived. That was my life. That's the setup. My brother Arthur called me at 7:12 that morning. Arthur is 3 years younger than me, 61 to my 64, and he spent the last 22 years as a long-haul commercial driver, 18-wheelers, refrigerated freight, the kind of work that takes a man away from home for days at a time and teaches him to read people fast because the rest stops and truck plazas are full of people you need to size up in about 30 seconds. Arthur is not a dramatic man. He does not call with rumors or half-stories. When Arthur calls at 7 in the morning while you're standing in your kitchen watching the sprinklers, you answer. "You home?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "Just made coffee." "Where are you?" "Pilot rest stop off 78, heading back from a run to Louisville." A pause. Not the kind where someone's thinking about what to say. The kind where they've already decided and they're just gathering themselves. "Is Gwen home?" I turned from the window, looked toward the ceiling as if I could see through it. "She's upstairs," I said. "Why?" Another pause. Longer. "Arthur, I need you to stay calm," he said. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you do anything." I sat down at the kitchen table. I don't remember deciding to sit. I just found myself in the chair. 3 days earlier, Arthur had stopped for fuel at a travel plaza off the highway outside of Columbus. It was late afternoon. The lot was crowded, and he was waiting in line behind a black SUV that had pulled in awkwardly and was taking too long. He'd gotten out to stretch his legs, walked along the side of the rig, and that's when he saw her. A woman was getting out of the passenger side of a silver sedan that had just parked in the row facing him. He knew the car. He knew it because it was my car, a 2019 Buick Enclave, silver, with a small dent on the rear quarter panel from when I'd backed into a parking bollard at the grocery store last winter and hadn't gotten around to fixing it. He knew the woman because he'd known her for 36 years. It was Gwendolyn. She was with a man Arthur didn't recognize. 50-something, Arthur said. Well-dressed for a rest stop. They weren't touching, weren't doing anything that, on its own, would mean anything. But Arthur said, and this is Arthur, a man who does not editorialize, that the way they stood together, the way she leaned toward him when she was talking, the way he put his hand briefly at the small of her back before they walked inside together, Arthur said it looked like people who knew each other well. Not colleagues at a rest stop. Not old friends passing through. He didn't approach her. He didn't call me that day, or the next. He said he drove the rest of the way to Louisville and back, trying to decide if he was sure enough to say anything. He was afraid of being wrong. He was more afraid of being right and saying nothing. So he called me at 7:12 on a Tuesday morning. She was with someone, he said. I don't know who. But the way it looked, I can't not tell you. I can't do that to you. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment. The coffee was in my other hand, and I realized I'd been holding it the whole time and it had gone cold. "I hear you," I said. "You okay?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Let me think." I didn't go upstairs. I didn't do anything sudden. That surprises people when I tell them, but I've been around long enough to understand that the first thing you do in a crisis is usually the thing you regret most. So I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what I actually knew versus what I'd been told. What I knew, Arthur had seen Gwen in my car at a rest stop outside Columbus with a man he didn't recognize 3 days ago. What I'd been told, it looked like more than professional. It looked like comfort, familiarity. What I didn't know, everything else. Here's what I also knew, and this is the part that started to crystallize in that kitchen that morning, slow and cold, like ice forming on the inside of a window. Gwen had told me 3 days ago that she was driving up to see her sister in Cleveland. Her sister Phyllis, who I've met dozens of times, who called our house on holidays, who sent our grandchildren, the ones we didn't have yet, birthday cards with cash inside because she said gift cards felt impersonal. Columbus is between here and Cleveland. That's not suspicious on its own. But Gwen had been gone for 2 nights. She said Phyllis was dealing with some health things and needed the company. I hadn't thought twice about it. I remember wishing her a safe drive and going back to whatever I was reading. I put my coffee mug in the sink. I walked to the front window and looked out at the driveway. My car was there. She was home. I went upstairs. She was in the bathroom, shower running. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, looking at her side of the bed, her reading glasses on the nightstand, a library book she'd been working through for the past month. Normal things. Her travel bag was on the floor by the closet, partially unzipped. I went back downstairs. What I didn't do in the next 24 hours, confront her, cry, break anything, call anyone other than my son Teddy, and even that call I kept vague. I just wanted to hear his voice. He talked about his boy for 10 minutes and I listened, and it helped. What I did do, I started paying attention. I'm an accountant, retired now, but for 40 years I read numbers for a living, and what I learned in 40 years is that numbers don't lie, but people arrange them to tell the story they want told. You have to know where to look for what's missing, the gap between what's reported and what actually happened. That's where the truth lives. So I started looking at what was reported versus what actually happened. I went back through our joint checking account, not looking for anything dramatic, just looking. Over the previous 8 months, there were cash withdrawals I hadn't paid attention to. Small ones, the kind that don't trip any automatic flags, the kind a person does when they're thinking about not being noticed. 200 here, 150 there, a handful of them. Not enough to alarm, but enough in pattern to mean something. I checked our joint savings. Fine. I checked the credit card statements. There was a charge to a hotel in Columbus from 3 nights ago. The city matched. The dates matched. The amount, 2 nights, 1 room, told me what I needed to know about how she'd spent those nights, and it wasn't with Phyllis. I didn't print anything. I didn't confront her with it. I just sat with it. Kept looking. I thought about the last year. Gwen had taken a part-time job 8 months ago, bookkeeping for a small dental practice, she said. Something to keep her mind active. I was glad for it. I'd been worried about her, honestly. She'd seemed restless since we both stopped working full-time, the way some people get when routine falls away and they haven't figured out what to replace it with. The job seemed good for her. She seemed lighter. I understand now what that lightness was. I found him by accident, which is maybe the most humiliating part of the whole thing. I was looking through her email, not something I'd ever done before, not something I'd ever thought I needed to do, and the password was the same one she'd been using since 2009, the year our cat died, which is the kind of thing that tells you how rarely she thought about the possibility of being looked at. The emails weren't explicit. They weren't written by people who expected to be read. They were written in the easy shorthand of 2 people who'd stopped feeling the need to explain themselves to each other, which almost made it worse. His name was Frederick. He ran an HVAC business in Westerville. 54 years old, divorced twice based on one passing reference. He'd been introduced to Gwen through the dental practice where she worked, a mutual client situation from what I could piece together. Their first email exchange was 7 months ago. By the 4th month, they were coordinating around my schedule. I am 64 years old. I have been married for 36 years. I have 2 children who love me, and I have a brother who drove back from Louisville and spent 3 days deciding whether to tell me a hard truth because he loves me. I want to be clear about that. I have good things. I knew that, even sitting there in the kitchen at 11 at night reading emails I wasn't meant to read. I knew that I was not without, but I'll tell you what it felt like. It felt like standing in a room you've lived in for decades and noticing for the first time that all the walls are slightly crooked. Nothing is where you thought it was. Your whole sense of the space has to be revised, and you can't unsee it. You walk through every memory and you recalibrate. That trip to Savannah 2 years ago. The Christmas she seemed distracted. The birthday dinner where she kept checking her phone and said it was Rue. All of it shifts. Not because it definitely means something, but because now you have to wonder, and wondering is its own kind of damage. I spent 2 weeks gathering information the way I used to gather financial documents before an audit, quietly, without rushing, without letting on. I spoke to a family law attorney. I did this without telling Gwen, without telling Teddy or Rue, without telling anyone except Arthur, who I called one evening and asked to keep quiet. The attorney's name was Rosalind Marsh, and she walked me through what I needed to understand about her situation in a state that still considers marital misconduct relevant to certain aspects of divorce proceedings. Not decisive, she said, but relevant. She told me to document. I documented. I moved a portion of our liquid assets, my portion, funds I brought into the marriage and tracked carefully over the years, into a separate account my father had left me that Gwen had never had access to and hadn't thought about in years. I did this legally. I did this after speaking with Rosalind. I want to be clear about that. I want to be clear about something else. I am not by nature a cold person. People who know me would probably describe me as steady, measured. My daughter has told me before that I process things slowly but thoroughly, and that when I come to a conclusion, I tend to stay there. That's accurate. What I did in those 2 weeks was not coldness. It was care for myself, for my children, for the next part of my life. I confronted Gwen on a Saturday morning. She was making eggs. I came downstairs and I sat at the kitchen table, the same chair, and I waited until she turned around. "Tell me about Frederick," I said. She froze, just for a second, and then something in her face shifted. Not to guilt, not exactly, but to a kind of exhaustion, like she'd been carrying weight and had just been told she could put it down. I didn't know what to make of that then. I've thought about it a lot since. She turned off the stove. She sat down across from me. She didn't lie. I'll give her that. She could have lied. She could have tried. Instead, she told me it had started in the fall, that it had not been planned, that she hadn't meant for it to become what it became, and that she was sorry. She said the word sorry several times, and I believe she meant it, which is the strange thing about being married to someone for 36 years. You can tell when they mean something. That doesn't make the something better, but you know. "Have you been happy?" I asked her. It's not the question I'd planned to ask. It came out of somewhere I hadn't accessed in a while. She was quiet for a long time. "I don't think I knew what I needed," she finally said. "I don't think I asked for it." I sat with that. I'm still sitting with it, if I'm honest. We didn't yell. We didn't throw things. We talked for 3 hours that morning, and then I went for a walk, a long one, through the neighborhood, past the elementary school where Teddy and Rue had gone, past the park where Arthur and I used to shoot hoops when we were young and stupid, and the world felt like it was still building itself into something. I walked until my hips told me to stop. When I came home, she was in the guest room. She'd moved there without being asked. That told me something about where she was, too. We told the kids together, a week later, on a video call. Teddy took it hard the way men take things they don't know what to do with. He went quiet, and I could see him working to control his face. Rue cried and then got angry, and then asked very precise questions the way she always has, even as a little girl. They're good kids. They're going to be fine. We told them it was our business to sort out and that they didn't need to choose. Gwen and I have been in the same house for 2 more months since then. It's stranger than I expected and also more ordinary than I expected. We're courteous. We sometimes talk in the evenings. There is grief in it, real grief. The kind that comes from the end of something that was real, that produced children, that filled 36 years with ordinary and specific and unrepeatable moments. She's looking for an apartment. I've told her to take her time. I mean it. The divorce will be quiet. Rosalind says these things don't have to be wars. We've lived long enough to know that wars cost more than whatever you win. I told Arthur that I owe him. He told me I don't owe him anything. He said anyone would do the same. I told him not everyone would, because it's true. Not everyone has the courage to make a hard call when they'd rather not be involved. He got quiet in the way he does, and then said he had to get back on the road, which is how Arthur ends conversations that get too close to something real. I still stand at the kitchen window in the mornings. The neighbor's sprinklers still come on at 6:45. They're automatic, predictable. I've stopped taking predictability for granted, which I suppose is either a loss or a lesson depending on what day you ask me. Some mornings it feels like both. Here's what I know. I'm 64. I'm healthy. I have children who love me and a brother who drove back from Louisville and made a hard phone call because he couldn't do otherwise. I have 40 years of experience reading what's actually there versus what's been arranged to look like something else. And I have, for what feels like the first time in longer than I can account for, a clear sense of what the next chapter actually looks like. Not what I planned, not what I would have chosen, but mine. That has to count for something. I've decided it does. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. That's one of the things about being 64 that nobody tells you when you're younger. You have more time than you expect, and you have fewer places left to hide from yourself. So you sit, and you think, and eventually you start to see the shape of things clearly. What Arthur did took something that most people underestimate. It would have been easier for him to drive back from Louisville and say nothing. He could have told himself he wasn't sure. He could have told himself it wasn't his business. A lot of people would have made that choice and called it kindness. But Arthur understood something that I think more of us need to sit with. Silence in the face of something wrong is not neutral. It has weight. It lands somewhere. He chose honesty over comfort. His comfort, not mine, and that is not a small thing. That is the kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It just acts. And I've thought a lot about my own part in this. Not to punish myself, but because I think honesty requires that too. There were years in our marriage where I was present without being there. I provided, I showed up, I was steady. But steady can become a kind of absence if you're not careful. I treated our life like a well-maintained account. Balanced, in order. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't absent in any dramatic way. But I stopped asking the question I finally asked Gwen that Saturday morning over cold eggs. Are you happy? I stopped asking because I assumed I already knew the answer. Assumption is comfortable. It is also, over time, a way of not looking. I don't say this to excuse what she did. What she did caused real damage. To me, to our children's sense of the ground beneath them, to 36 years of shared memory that now has to be re-examined. Actions have consequences that don't disappear because the intentions behind them were complicated. That's just true. Gwendolyn made choices, and those choices had a cost that she will carry in some form for the rest of her life, as she should. But I also made choices. Smaller ones, quieter ones, accumulated over years, and those choices contributed to a marriage that had gone hollow in places I hadn't wanted to look at. What I know now, what I'd tell anyone who finds themselves standing where I stood, is that paying attention is not optional. Not in your finances, not in your work, and not in your most important relationships. Neglect doesn't announce itself. It just quietly does its damage until the day something forces you to look at what's actually there versus what you assumed was there. I spent 40 years as an accountant because I understood that the gap between what's reported and what's real is where the truth lives. I applied that discipline to everything except my own life. That was the real oversight. I'm not starting over. I'm too old for that framing and too honest to use it. I'm continuing, with better information, clearer eyes, and a much stronger conviction that the people who tell you hard truths are the ones worth keeping close. Arthur called me from a rest stop off Route 78 and changed the course of my life. He didn't do it because it was easy. He did it because it was right. That's the only kind of courage that actually counts.